Frozen mud of Champagne in early 1915 amid barbed wire, shattered trees, and corpses half buried in the snow. 4 French corporals made a decision that would change their lives and the reputation of the French army forever. A decision to refuse a suicidal order, a decision that would lead their own general to do the unthinkable, try to order artillery to fire on the very man he commanded. A decision that ended in execution, cover up, and decades-long fight for justice. And a decision that 42 years later would inspire one of the greatest anti-war films ever made, Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory. Today, we're telling the story of the Souain Corporals affair, a story of courage, cruelty, and the devastating cost of pride during the First World War. February 10th, 1915. The whistle blows. But the men do not climb the ladders. They do not push forward into the snow. They stay in the trench. And when the general hears this, he calls the artillery commander and shouts, "Fire on our own lines." The artillery officer refuses. It should have ended there. But for four corporals, it was only the beginning. To understand Souain, we have to understand the world that created it, the early Western Front of the First World War. 1914 had begun with movement, invading armies, counterattacks, cities taken and retaken. But by the winter of 1914, the movement had frozen into the brutal truth. No one was going anywhere. The French and Germans had dug themselves into zigzag trenches stretching hundreds of miles. Between them lay no man's land, a wasteland of craters, bodies, and barbed wire. Generals across Europe struggled to adapt. Many clung to outdated ideas and tactics of honor, courage, and decisive offensive change. They believed morale, not machine guns, would decide the war. This belief that these old-fashioned generals believed in would cost thousands, their hundreds and thousands of lives during the course of the war. In the Champagne sector, near the village of Souain, French commanders insisted the German lines could be broken with enough pressure, and General Gerard Ravelhock, commander of the 21st Infantry Regiment of the French Army, felt that pressure keenly. By early 1915, the French army had already launched several attacks near Souain, and all had failed disastrously. The ground was open, exposed, and watched by German machine gun nests dug into higher ground across the entire line. Soldiers described the sector as a killing field shaped like a bowl. Yet, orders came down from another assault on the 10th of February. Reports from the trenches said snow was waist deep. Machine gun fire was unrelenting. First wave casualties were catastrophic, and visibility was near zero. Officers passed this up the chain of command, begging for cancellation. General Ravelhock responded, "Attack anyway." And so at dawn, the first wave went over the top, and within seconds, men were cut down, falling into the snow as bullets whipped the air. A surviving private later recalled, quote, "We moved 5 meters before the ground became carpeted with the dead," unquote. Back in the trenches, Corporals Philippe Maupas, Louis Garrard, Lucien Lechat, and Louis Leveron watched the massacre unfold. Their captain refused to lead his company out. He believed the orders were suicidal. So the corporals stayed put. From their perspective, it wasn't a rebellion. It was a simple case of survival. To General Ravelhock, it was humiliation. When Ravelhock learned the second wave had advanced, he erupted. He demanded immediate disciplinary action. He called his artillery commander's post, stationed behind the lines, and ordered, "Shell the trenches, fire on their sector where our men refuse to advance." The artillery commander, horrified, asked for the order in writing, standard procedure for any action that risked friendly fire. Rawhawk paused. A written order would expose him. It would follow him up the chain, stain his career, and perhaps even end it. He refused to put it on paper. The artillery officer refused to fire. This moment, one general tried to kill his own men to force them into a hopeless attack because one of the most infamous events of World War I. In Past the Glory, this very scene recreated almost beat for beat, but the reality was even uglier, because when Rawhawk couldn't have his men killed by artillery, he decided to kill them through the courts. Rawhawk ordered each company to provide 2 men to be tried for cowardice. The company officer stalled. They knew the truth. No one had disobeyed. The order itself had been impossible. But when the general insisted someone would be punished, they had to follow those orders. So the officers did what soldiers across history have done under impossible pressure. They chose names. Not based on guilt, not based on evidence, simply based on being corporals, low enough rank to be sacrificial, high enough to set an example. The 4 chosen were Theophile Malpas, a respected, thoroughful 40-year-old and a schoolteacher before the war; Louis Gerhard, a married man and a father; Louis Lefron, a quiet, hard-working Frenchman; and Etienne Lechat, known for bravery in earlier battles he fought in. None were troublemakers, none had refused a direct order. They were simply convenient. Captain Eckelby, who had refused to lead the charge, tried to defend his men. He told investigators that the attack was madness, and no one could have advanced. Yet he was ignored. The trial that would eventually unfold lasted just a few hours. The corporals were not allowed legal representation, witnesses, testimony that criticized higher command, or evidence showing the impossibility of the attack. The judges were all officers under Rawhawk's command. Their careers depended on pleasing higher command. So the outcome was already predetermined. The prosecutor argued that example was necessary. One corporal tried to explain their captain had refused to advance. The panel cut him off. His words could undermine discipline. The verdict came hard and fast. Guilty, along with a sentence of death by firing squad. A private present at the trial wrote in his diary, quote, "It was not a trial. It was an execution scheduled in advance." Unquote. On the morning of March 17, 1915, at dawn, 4 corporals were tied to stakes. Soldiers from their regiment, some weeping, were ordered to form a firing squad. A priest prayed. Letters from their families were read. Malpas reportedly stood tall, saying only, quote, "I die innocent. My only regret is for my wife." Unquote. The rifles fired, 4 men fell, and the French army moved on. But their families would not. After the war, France began grappling with the trauma of millions of dead, and with the darker truths of how the war had been fought. Marie Anne Malpas, Theophille's widow, led the campaign for justice. She gathered testimonies from soldiers, officers, chaplains, and anyone who had been present. Her fight lasted nearly 20 years. Finally, in 1934, a French military appeals court overturned the convictions. The court ruled the attack order had been nearly impossible. The trench had been under direct lethal machine gun fire, and the officers had selected corporals arbitrarily. The 4 men were declared innocent, their reputation restored. Their widows received compensation, but the men themselves were gone forever. The Souain corporals affair might have faded into the archives of military history, another tragedy among many, if not for a film released in 1957. Stanley Kubrick's Past the Glory, a movie that shocked the world, a movie so pointed in its criticism of French wartime leadership that it was banned in France for nearly 20 years. Much of the film was fictionalized, but the emotional core came straight from Souain. Impossible attack, general furious at humiliation, men chosen at random to be executed, a ferocious court-martial, and yes, the general ordering artillery to fire on his own trenches. Kubrick didn't exaggerate that scene. He toned it down. The real story was worse. In the film, the condemned men were portrayed as sympathetic, fearful, and human. But the real corporals were more than characters. They were husbands, sons, workers, and teachers. Their deaths and their later exoneration sparked France to re-examine the brutality of wartime discipline, ultimately leading to reforms in military justice. When we tell stories of World War I, we often focus on the battles, the strategies, the empires clashing in mud. But stories like Souain reveal something deeper, that sometimes the biggest horrors of war come not from the enemy, but from your own side. From pride, from fear, from commanders looking terrified or trying not to look weak. The Souain corporals were not cowards. They were soldiers trapped in a system that valued obedience over humanity. And their story lived on because people refused to forget. Wives who petitioned, soldiers who testified, artists who transformed tragedy into truth. Kubrick's Path to Glory reminds us that courage doesn't always mean charging into gunfire. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to die for a lie. The French government eventually acknowledged the injustice, but the best memorial is the lesson. No army, no nation, no commander is infallible. And when the cost of pride is human life, courage sometimes means saying no.